Good evening. Welcome to the first fall evening lecture series of the year. We will get better timing in the future, so 6 o'clock promptly. Bring all your friends. Tonight we're very pleased to be able to welcome Daan Roggeveen to UIC in Chicago as part of the joint Midwest tour that's been co-organized with Michael Speaks at the University of Kentucky and Aaron Betsky and William Williams in Cincinnati. And just so that you can be prepared, the next lecture will be Tom Leader, landscape architect from San Francisco, on October 29th. After studying architecture and real estate at Delft, Daan worked as an architect for, among others, NL Architects in Amsterdam and MADA in Shanghai, where he has since been working as a freelance architect, photographer, and researcher, and since 2009, co-founder of Go West, the Go West project. Go West is a multidisciplinary research and design studio focusing on the rise of mega cities in the heart of China. And last year they published the book, How the City Moved to Mr. Sun, China's New Mega Cities. In a super loose analogy, you could say that Daan is to these cities what Michael Moore is to Flint, Michigan, though in exactly the opposite way, accelerated by a millionfold. In other words, this is not about the abandonment of the city by people, but the delivery of the city to the people. In other words, in China, the situation seems to be that cities move faster than populations. Daan's Mr. Sun, the new prototype and main protagonist of the book, is the new kind of Chinese farmer architect, though I imagine a rather different figure than the U.S.'s historical father figure and farmer architect Thomas Jefferson. Maybe Mr. Sun is more like one of our Chicago apocryphal and real figures, namely Captain Streeter, a kind of version of someone who invented a new territory, new land, only to have it quickly appropriated by larger developmental interests. But I think that for our purposes here at UIC, this collision, you could say, of the rural and urban that Daan is looking at in China has a lot of connections to the research that we're doing, and certainly just anecdotally, and off the top of my head, thinking of the things that, for example, Luis is doing in the research studio, also on that interface of the rural and the urban, the collapse of those things, and how different kinds of cities might be extrapolated from a rural code. What's, I think, really interesting in the material that Daan is putting together and the way that he's thinking about it is how to overcome what you could say is the informal, formal divide of characterizing contemporary urban configurations, as these Chinese villages are both at once extreme top-down and extreme bottom-up strategies at the same time. So please join me in welcoming Daan Roggeveen to UIC in Chicago, America's rural metropolis, and speculating on how we might extend these lessons here elsewhere in the future. To Daan.
Well, thank you, Robin. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's a great honor to see so many people being interested in our work. Once again, Robert, thank you very much for the invitation. I also have to thank Michael Speaks for setting this whole series up here in the Midwest and initiating me or us being here. Well, go from this sort of video to the slides. Yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in Central and Western China, especially about our book, How the City Moved to Mr. Sun. I wrote that book, we did that research together with my colleague Michiel Doshoff, who cannot be here today because he just recently became a father. But the reason that I always start showing this slide is for two purposes. One is because we do a lot of co-lectures and then you, the audience, know who to. But secondly, it's also to emphasize that we are working on the verge of as a crossover professions, which is architecture and journalism, obviously. And that is that, so we are not approaching architecture and the urban, with the, let's say, the typical architectural tools at hand, but we use journalistic research methods to investigate the urban. So we use street reports, photo series, and essays as our means of understanding the urban, which is pretty important when you work in such dynamic conditions as Chinese cities. That basically, where basically drawing a map is a waste of time because the city has already been changed once your map is finished. Well, and we did that under the name, and we still work together, we still cooperate on the name Go West Project, and that is an office for research, architecture, and media based in Amsterdam and Shanghai. I've been working and living in Shanghai for over the past 4 years, and my colleague currently works from Amsterdam. And our work has been focusing, as Bob already mentioned, on cities in Central and Western China, and led to this book, How the City Moved to Mr. Stone. And today I will discuss a couple of, well, the book sort of tries to describe the transformations of cities in Central and Western China to potential world cities. And today I'm going to discuss a couple of phenomena that these cities could characterize. We also have a Dutch edition for the people that might be interested. It's called the Stad Dynamic Verhuizen. And early next year we will launch our Chinese edition of our book. But let me first introduce you to someone we met in our travels. We traveled 20 cities in Central and Western China over the past 4 years and met hundreds of people, obviously. One of them is Mr. Ben in the city of Chongqing. Chongqing is a bustling megacity of 33 million inhabitants, of which 10 million live in the urban core. And the Chinese like to, or especially the people, inhabitants of Chongqing, like to think of Chongqing as China's Chicago. So do whatever you like, but this is sort of your colleagues in China. Chongqing is an amazing city, very dynamic. It's one of the 3 ovens in China, so in the summer it's 45 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees. It's super hot, super dynamic, very lively. And in the heart of that city, we met this guy, Mr. Deng. He's 37 years old and a very friendly fellow. And he moved from the countryside to the city to start his own restaurant, which is called Yang Ping. This is the restaurant. Very, well, basic place, as you could call it. And this restaurant is basically positioned in over here. Over there. And that is, it seems to be a construction site, but it's actually a village. This is a village, a floating village. Basically supporting the construction workers that work on the construction site. They're working on these residential towers. There's 700 construction workers working 7 days a week on these towers, and 100 people that support them. And this village basically contains all facilities that the village has, like residential, so this is the housing where these construction workers live. It has a fresh market immediately under the elevated highway, so there are fresh vegetables that don't get wet. There's a doctor that can do, who has medicines and also can do like small injuries. Like for 50 cents, $50, and you have like your finger or your arm. Bandage. Thank you. And there's a cinema. 50 cents for a movie with all kinds of Western movies like Bruce Willis and this kind of stuff. There's a hair salon. There is in my time place, and there's even a casino where you can spend your hard-earned money and gamble it away. But that's of course not what Mrs. Dang are going to do. They work every day very hard in a restaurant to earn money and to save that for the education of their son. Their son is 14 years old and still lives with his grandparents on the countryside. So that means Mr. and Mrs. Daan basically moved from within, their migrants within China, they moved from the countryside to the city, but their child stayed behind because he cannot go to school in the city since his urban registration just bounds him to the countryside. China has a urban and rural registration system which makes it impossible for people to move their pension or their education or their insurance to another place. So you could compare Mr. and Mrs. Daan with migrants in, for example, like the North Africans in Europe or the Mexicans here in the States, working illegally without registration, without social security, but the difference is, of course, Mr. Daan is living in his own country. Why am I explaining this? Because this is an example of the big movement of migration that is currently taking place in China. Until 30 years ago, China, or 35 years ago, China was a rural society. China was a society where 80% of the people lived on the countryside. And that changed after the opening up of China in 1978 by Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader of the country. And he basically replaced the countryside by the city as the focus of the Chinese economic model. Until 78, the countryside was the heart of the Chinese economic model, and that was replaced by the urban, by the city. And that led to migration to the south, so to this area here, the Pearl River Delta, and to this coastal area in the east, around Shanghai and Beijing. And that development went with an amazing speed, as we all know. This is Shenzhen city just north of Hong Kong in 1983. This is Shanghai Boulevard, and this is the same street 27 years later. So this is the spatial impact of economic development. And this urbanization continues with a spectacular pace. In the coming 20 years, 300 million people will move from the countryside to the city. So that is people like Mr. Daan picking up their stuff and moving to the city to build up a better life. Basically, people move to the city to improve their life, get a better income, and especially in China, the income disparity between the rural and the urban is 3, 4, to 5-fold. So it pays off to move to the city. 300 million people is as much people as live in the United States. So the impact of this urbanization is gigantic, obviously. It means that the urban infrastructure that the states have, or comparable amount, of course, has to be created in China as well to serve all these people that move from the countryside to the city. When we look at figures and we compare Chinese urbanization, this graph is showing percentage of people living in cities here, and this is time. This is time, this is percentage of people living in cities. And we see that actually China, compared with other countries, has still a very low percentage of people living in cities. Only half of the Chinese live in cities, whereas in the States or in Europe or in Brazil, around 80-85% of the people live in cities. That means two things. First, that time of the way the society is organized in China is very different than in the rest of the world, than in these parts of the world. And secondly, that this growth, this urbanization will continue in the coming years. It's just a sort of law of nature that people will continue moving to cities. It also leads to big questions on what's then happening on the countryside. Maybe we can discuss that in the Q&A later. I'll touch on that, but not very deeply now. Questions, of course, where do these people end up? Where do people like Mr. Daan and his fellow migrants end up? Not only on the East Coast anymore, not only in cities like Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing anymore, but also and especially in cities in central China, cities like Chongqing, Chengdu, Kunming, Zhejiang, Bohol, Lanzhou. Cities with millions of inhabitants that are pretty unknown to the outside world, but are part of a, let's say, the fastest urbanizing region in the world at this moment. I always forget to ask this in the beginning. Who of you has been to China before? 17%? Okay, no, yeah, okay. It's also a good indication to know how much I can make up. Okay. Well, but this whole urbanization leads to a very, Robert was already mentioning it, a clash between the rural and the urban. Like here in Chongqing, for example, we were very naive when we shot this picture and really thought, well, it's nice people in their flats who still do their farming in the countryside. But obviously the opposite is happening here. Urbanization takes place so fast that the rural really are well, creating sort of Photoshop reality. Same as here in Zhejiang, where we interviewed a farmer that already lived in the apartment building, but still was putting his harvest out on the sort of central square to dry. It was his last corn harvest, and then after that he would get rid of his land and well, live as an urban citizen. Or here in Bohol, the capital of Inner Mongolia. Well, this picture doesn't need any explanation about how the urban and rural touch upon each other. Well, the question is, of course, these cities in Central and Western China, what kind of cities are these? Well, just to show you some data, we are not really like traditional data crunchers. We already explained to you that we're not like a bit differently, but just to give you an indication, we made a comparison between 10 world cities and 10 potential world cities, namely cities in Central China. Well, cities in Central China are big. They have a big amount of inhabitants. The average world city has roughly 7 million inhabitants, whereas cities in Central China on average have like 10 million people. Same goes for skylines. This is the top 3 highest buildings in world cities and cities in Western China. 260 meters versus 180 meters. The thing is, 2 interesting things. First, figures on the left are 1.5 years old. So the right side of the graph is probably been growing over time. Secondly, if you would not take the top 3 but the top 50, then they would be probably as high or maybe even higher cities in China. They are pretty dense and pretty high actually. There's mainly high-rise. The high-rise is mainly the typology in China. And then the soft side of the city is the amount of top universities. Average Chinese city has half a top-notch university in its city, whereas the average world city has 3.5. Same goes for cinemas. 124 versus 14 cinema screens. And this is about starting fees of taxis. This is in RMB, so the average world city has a starting fee of $3.5, and the average Chinese city has a starting fee of $1 as an indication of economic growth or economic development. Very superficial and, let's say, short analysis shows that Chinese cities are big, high, but on, let's say, educational level, cultural level, and economic level, they are developing. They are very much in underdevelopment and lagging behind compared with the world cities at this moment. Okay. Well, the question is, of course, maybe even much more interesting, especially at a university, at an architectural school. What do the cities look like? Well, and the only solution is going there. So China has an amazing network of high-speed railways developed over the past 3-4 years. The bailout program of the Chinese government was the same as of the same amount as the United States, roughly $800 billion. And it will mainly in infrastructure, especially in high-speed trains. So it's now possible to travel through the whole of China with a train that goes roughly 350 kilometers an hour. Pretty luxurious from the inside. And it makes it possible to travel from Shanghai to the city of Jingzhou in 5-6 hours. And just for your reference, Jingzhou is 7 million inhabitants and it's the capital of Henan province. Henan has 90 million inhabitants. So Henan is basically as big as France in terms of inhabitants, and Jingzhou is its Paris. Just sort of to frame this, to frame what we're talking about. Well, and then when you arrive at the central railway station of Jingzhou, this is basically what you see. So a pretty chaotic situation. People from all over the province arriving there, building up their lives. Youth hanging around. You see poverty, which you also see sort of signs of, well, strong signs of capitalism. And remains of communism. This is a guarding of a residential neighborhood called Danwei, so a former factory residential neighborhood. You see pollution. This is pollution is one of the biggest problems in China at this moment. I guess this is sort of Dickensian picture with people really living here. So this is a residential block. And all kinds of sort of bizarre type of architecture. This is a sort of postmodern Las Vegas kind of style that we didn't really grasp. So the city has a very chaotic mix of, let's say, the remains of communist architecture, Russian influenced, very unorganized in a way, very commercial also, developed very quickly over the past years. And then it has also developed a sort of body double. But that body double has a total different appearance, namely this. So where the old city has all this sort of disadvantages of being chaotic, unorganized, dirty, etc., etc. Next to the old city center, there's now a new city center that is being prepared, as was already mentioned, for 1 million new inhabitants. And what we see here is basically an artificial lake surrounded by a 4-kilometer long shopping mall, circular shopping mall. I mean, if you plan to design a shopping mall, make it circular, because people keep on shopping and just forget that they're finishing. And then there's the sort of usual suspects of Chinese urbanism. So there's a very big conference center, very smart because it attracts a lot of people. So when you make a new city plan, you first make a conference center, that attracts a lot of people, and it generates a sort of, well, traffic, and people know the construction of the place. Then there's the hotel under construction nearby as well. There is a cultural center here, and there is residential elements, obviously, on top of the shopping mall. Urban plan by Kishika Kurokawa, by the way. This is then the Conference Center 5 Golden Eggs, designed by the Uruguayan architect Carlos Ott. And he's also, it's a very typical thing for China, I think, or for emerging economies maybe in general. He's a member of this sort of league of unknown group, league of architects that is not publishing in the traditional magazines, but producing 100,000 square meters of architecture in countries like Kazakhstan or in the Gulf, and also in cities all over China. So these guys, they win master plan after master plan without the world knowing. A very interesting league in modern architecture these days. Well, this shape refers to a classical Chinese instrument. So that is then the new type of city that sort of emerges, a merger of, let's say, the Frankfurt kind of skyline with a Vancouver kind of residential neighborhood. This was a Canadian town, so that's the reason I mentioned it. This is, realized basically in 6 years. So 6 years ago there was nothing here, and this city, this is the old city that I mentioned already, 7 million inhabitants, and this city doubles itself here with an area as big as Paris within periphery. So I'm doing everything in meters and kilometers. So 60 square kilometers of urban planning here, and the circus thing I was talking about is this thing actually. Just to give you a sort of impression on size and scale, well, the first time we visited this area was in 2009, and then this was basically our impression. Emptiness. So, a city that is preparing itself for its people. Beautiful infrastructure, but everything sort of, this was the only type of shops that was there. This and the Porsche showroom. So, that is a sort of type of services that is then apparent. And but when you came back, so because this was what was very strange is that we basically thought with such a residential area or with such a business area, it's called a CBD, Central Business District. You would expect like people in glitzy suits making deals and running around and nothing of that. And then we came back 1.5 years later. We saw this. We saw people and human activity, but then in a whole different way than we would have expected. Just people were inhabiting the city, but were flying kites with their grandchildren, or these kind of things that people do in cities. So, what I actually want to say, I think there's two things happening here, and that is first that the city is, well, first this is a pretty well-known story about China, right? So, a country that has a lot of power, economic and political power to get things done, to make things happen, to push forward and create cities overnight, basically instant cities. It's a sort of, that's the well-known story that is also being picked up by the news media in the West pretty well, I guess. Today I also want to discuss the other part of that story, and that is actually a lesser known thing. And that is the story of Mr. Sun. Mr. Sun is, we met Mr. Sun in Zhejiang, the capital of Hebei province. Hebei is this province, so it's around Beijing, and Zhejiang is a city of 4 million inhabitants. And this is Mr. Sun. He is 65 years old, lived on he's a farmer, and also a colleague of us, an architect. And the way how he became from, let's say, a corn-growing farmer in a village close to a unknown city, to an architect is actually saying a lot about the development of the Chinese city. Until the halfway in the 90s, Mr. Sun was living in his farm, growing corn. They had some livestock, some chicken, and some pigs that they would slaughter in Chinese New Year. That would be the only moment in the year that they would meet. And life was simple and well, pretty basic until halfway in the 90s, and then they saw something happening. They saw the city arriving to their farm, and then, at that moment, Mr. Sun was forced to sell his land. The government took his land and gave him a sort of small compensation for that. And then he did something very strange. So he broke down his farm and he replaced it by a new house. This house, 4 stories high, 800 square meters, so it's 8,000 square foot. It's easy math, man. 2 floors of let's say business real estate to rent out to shops or something like this. then floor for himself, for an apartment, then one floor to rent out rooms, to rent out to migrants, and then on top he would make a garden. So basically what he did was on the first and second floor, there was space that he rented out to an internet provider. Then he had his own apartment of 200 square meters with like great good kitchen, bathrooms, etc. TV, pretty decent. And 200 square meters is quite a big thing, right? On the floor above that, he had small rooms surrounding a patio, as you see here. Those small rooms he would rent out to people that came to the city, just to work. For example, construction workers or people that work in restaurants, people that come to the city to build and would end up having a room with Mr. Sun. And on top he made, most part of all, a farm field. So basically he grew 26 different types of crops there. He had ponds there, 2 fish ponds. And on beautiful summer nights he would go to his roof, light a barbecue, and eat the fruit of his land, overlooking his former farm field, which is now a golf course. Now, that's nice, right? That's a different story. And Mr. Sun is actually not the only person, not the only farmer in China doing this. Every year, there's 1 million farmers in China breaking down their house and building up a new building, replacing that with a bigger building that's just like Mr. Sun did. Like, for example, here in Lanzhou, where you see, what these farmers basically do is they create a new type of urbanism with that. So they create this new type of fine meshed urbanism that is very lively, as you can see here in this city, or in this part of the city in Lanzhou. It's very mixed. It has shops and services on the ground floors, so you can buy foods there, you can have your bike repaired, you can go to the hairdressers, etc., etc. It is, and these farmers are pretty creative, so they use every corner, basically, that they have to create their own architecture from the bottom up, providing for their own housing, providing for shops, providing for housing for, what you could say, social housing. Pretty creative also in creating all types of architectural shapes, like here in Kunming. And this one, for example, here we can really sort of see the stacked program, beautiful from the facade, shopping, warehousing, 2 layers of apartment buildings, apartments, and then a small house, literally a penthouse on the top of the building. And it leads to a sort of very fine meshed urbanism that these farms create. This is the village of the former village of Mr. Sun. And well, it's an aerial picture, and you see that let's say the north-south facing typical type of urbanism that Chinese residential blocks create is being intermixed with this very fine meshed structure that the village of Mr. Sun is creating. So it's a big contrast between this part of the area and this part. And it actually is an interesting alternative for this type of real estate that is currently overtaking China. The residential compound, a monotypical type of urbanism that is basically being repeated all over the country at this moment. Very popular and very, well, this is the way the Chinese live. The Chinese middle class is being housed. But this is what the farmers, so this is what the farmers create. Very sort of medium, 5, 6, 7 layer story, 5, 6, 7 story type of housing that is has sort of variants to it, architectural variants, if you like, and it is important to emphasize that this type of architecture goes beyond informal architecture like the slums in Rio or the favelas in the favelas in Rio or the slums in Mumbai. It's more solid. It's literally more concrete. It's more organized, and it's in that sense really another type of urbanism. And it's also important. Well, you can see that here that these are these kind of urban villages. This is the bottom of urbanism that then sort of starts to emerge. All this, and some cities even these urban villages take facilitate housing for half of their inhabitants. Like this city, Shenzhen, just north of Hong Kong. City of 15 million people, and half of them live in urban villages. And maybe this is a very good example of that. This is sort of mini Manhattan, where basically extrusion of the plots that these farmers have, and they just extrude that and create housing and facilities for low-income people. So it becomes this is basically a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it creates income, source of income for landless farmers, like Mr. Sun. On the other hand, it is a way of creating low-income housing for low-income people. And also in the city of Sujiatang, where the village of Mr. Sun is now part of, urban villages are pretty apparent. So this is an aerial picture of the city of Sujiatang, and all these yellow patches are basically envelopes of rural development within the urban patchwork. So within the urban fabric. So you see envelopes of rurality within the urban, literally in this picture. Now, I just discussed the qualities of this urban village. It's fine meshed, it's very lively, it's highly accessible. This also means you don't need a car to get around, right? So you can do everything by foot or by bike if you want. It's accessible for low-income people, and it creates a source of income for landless farmers. And even you can do like urban farming, which is now sort of very popular in theoretical discussions in the West. But Mr. Sun literally told us that architects in Beijing are talking about this, and I just did it. So all kinds of reasons to support this type of urbanism. Well, the Chinese government, or especially city governments, think different about this type of development, and they basically want to replace these villages for modern type of developments, because they don't fit in the modern idea of what a city should be. So when we were in Sujiatang in end of 2009, we saw this. This is basically half of the village of Mr. Sun was being taken down, and it should be replaced by this. This is a plan for the development of the village in 2012. 2 million square meters of real estate, basically, shopping mall, offices, hotel, Soho, which is a mix of, it's called small office home office, an interesting typology that only exists in China, I believe. A combination of, let's say, small housing where you can also set up your office, and then residential. Basically, as a replacement for the farmers who have been kicked out of their houses for this development. Well, and obviously, Mr. Sun and his fellow citizens, villagers don't like this plan very much, because they're pretty happy with their with how the way they live in their village. There are 1,200 families in this village, and each of them built their own house, just like Mr. Sun did. And well, they protested. They went to Beijing, and then Beijing said, "Well, you're right." Came back to their own city, and then said, "Yeah." The local government said, "Yeah, but this is in Beijing." So basically, without success. So this is the house of Mr. Sun when we visited it for the last time in September 2009. And then after Chinese New Year 2010, that's around February, we received an email from someone from Shanghai saying, yeah, listen, I've been to this village and I saw this. So the house was being taken down, the whole village was gone, and well, then it went pretty quickly. So this is April 2010. This is June 2011. This is summer 2011. And then in April of this year, so April 2012, I thought, oh, it would be a good moment to go and visit the city of Sujatwana and see what happened to the village of Mr. Sun. And then I went there, so this. So this is what was left of the village of Mr. Sun after 2.5 years. So, and I must say that I've been in China for 4 years now, and I saw quite some speedy developments, but this really is amazing in terms of size and speed. I wanted to start this lecture with a comparison or some sort of historical image of the US in one of the cities in the US in the 20s or the 30s, you know, with this very speedy development, and I didn't do it because I think it's very tricky to talk about something you don't know anything about. In this case, me in the US. But in a way, sort of the super fast development has a sort of similarity. Maybe we can also discuss this in Q&A later. Anyway, so this is what remains of the countryside after 2.5 years. Well, so the whole sort of fine mesh scale and very lively atmosphere is well, has been taken over by another type of scale of urbanism that our people now are sort of inhabiting at this moment. Well, that starts to take place at this moment. And then I also was curious, of course, what happened to the location of the house of Mr. Sun. So I went there and I ordered a latte because it was turned into a Starbucks at this moment. And I mean, you can't make this up. This is on the location of the house is now a Starbucks, and it is one of the most popular places in town. So the youth of the city gathers there and meets up there and has dating there and the whole thing. I mean, it's a big thing on the internet as well. Like the city is finally has a Starbucks. Well, so that's basically what took place in this. Well, the shopping mall is gigantic. You can have German food there and all kinds of 20. I think there's maybe 30 types of different restaurants, sushi, etc. Very modern, IMAX theater. So this is really the countryside transformed into a city. And then the question is, of course, what happened to Mr. Sun? Because we got rid of him, we lost track of him. And he didn't have a mobile phone. He was a farmer and the owner of an internet bar, but he was still sitting on his farmland on top of his building without having a mobile phone. So it was very difficult to find him back. We have an amazing girl who was able to find this guy back in a city of 4 million people. So, yeah, it's amazing. And he now lives on the other side of town with his son and daughter-in-law and their grandchildren. And he's pretty happy with their life. I mean, he's happy that he lives with his family, and he got compensation for his house. 75,000 US, which is a lot of money for a farmer who never had an education and who never basically did something else than who never went to school. But it's not so much for someone who created 800 square meters of real estate in the heart of a bustling city. So it's shades of grey, you would say. Mr. Sun is happy with his life, and at the same time he misses farming. Obviously, he says, "Well, it's a bit boring here." And when he this picture, he was watching a documentary about dinosaurs. That's what urban people do. Yeah. So he is basically, and that's I think is interesting about his story of Mr. Sun, is that he basically became an urban citizen without even intending to do so. So he just stayed on the place where he was for 65 years, and the city basically took over his life, and he transformed him, and the city transformed him in an urban citizen. Whereas with Mr. Deng, it was the other way around. Mr. Deng intentionally picked up his bag, went to town to start to become an urban citizen. The difference is, of course, that Mr. Sun is an urban citizen. He lives in the city. He has city rights, whereas Mr. Deng is basically a second-class citizen, working very hard, but in the end going back to the urban city. I think there's another story to this, and that is that we should maybe also see if we can learn from people like Mr. Sun, who built the city from the bottom up, and the type of architecture that they create, the type of basically maybe even more interesting, the type of urbanism that they create, has a lot of potential to it for I think for the Chinese city, especially at this moment, a city that is dominated by like big plans and big ideas, and very much, especially in our vision of architects, dominated by top-down planning. It's very inspiring to see people setting this up from the bottom up and creating a very lively condition. Well, the question is, of course, has this transformation of the countryside of the village of Mr. Sun to a urban condition, as we see it here? This is the central square of the former village. Has that now also led to a potential world city? Will Suzhou become a potential world city? Because what basically happened here is that Mr. Sun took his compensation money, but a lot of farmers took a compensation housing. So a lot of farmers ended up living in these skyscrapers. So we have farmers in skyscrapers now. Is that a world city? Well, in the definition of Saskia Sassen, you could say a world city is a city that has a impact on the worldwide network of cities, either politically or economically or let's say culturally. Beijing is a world city in terms of politics, which is like Washington DC. Economically, Zurich, a very tiny city in Switzerland, is a world city because its impact on the worldwide economics is so big. It's a city of bankers, a city of banks. And the same goes, I'm from Amsterdam, very tiny city, not even 1 million inhabitants, but its cultural infrastructure used to be pretty influential. So you could say Amsterdam is a world city, not by measure of size or skyline, but by measure of cultural. Well, to investigate this topic, we went to the city of Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan in southwest China. Sichuan is one of the bigger and more influential provinces in China, and Chengdu is its capital. It has 10 million inhabitants, pretty big for Chinese means, and to look at how to emerging megacities develop into cultural hotspots, we went to the outskirts, to Flower Town, on the fringe of the city of Chengdu. And there we went to look at an artist village, and we were wondering what a Chinese artist village looked like. And well, we found out that it looks like this: 20 modernist villas surrounding a parking place with Audis and Land Rovers. that was not completely what we had in mind, obviously. So we started walking around and questioning it, and we ran into his dog. It was owned by this guy, Roggeveen. A very, could say, yeah, he's a famous painter. He's one of the most famous painters of Chengdu and one of the most influential in China as well. Doing exhibitions internationally. He recently had a show in San Francisco, also in London and Amsterdam, France. Goes there as well for the openings, obviously. So, and Roggeveen invited us to come into his studio that he designed himself. Very beautiful space, where he produces his work, ceramics and also paintings. And he explained us how he came from a very unknown art school student and basically a painter operating in subcultures of Chengdu in the 80s to a well-known figure in the city of Chengdu. And that story is, I think, pretty representational for the development of Chinese art and creativity. What's the word? Creative scene, maybe, if you will, in Chinese cities, and maybe more in general, how cities in Western China start to look at the soft side of their development. This is also another word. He's a big fan of trance music. Art in China, until at the end of the 70s, all the art in China was political. So all art in China was related to politics. In the case of Roggeveen, was also the case. He told us, we made paintings, we made drawings in the 70s, but we didn't dare to draw anything else than political images because it was just impossible to do so. And then that changed after the opening up policy, and then when the universities and art schools opened again because they were closed during the Cultural Revolution. And Roggeveen attended the Chongqing Arts Academy. The Arts Academy of the city of Chongqing, just close to Chengdu, 200 kilometers. And he said it was amazing. He had an amazing time. There was a sort of vibe. You could really feel people were from all over China came to the school to study. Even had until then it was only possible to know about Soviet art. Right? So until end of the 70s, the only thing people knew was Soviet art and then Chinese art. It was all very political. And then suddenly there was all arts from the West also coming in. So there was, for example, a librarian at this art school that had that bought a big book, art history, 2,000 years of art history or so, and then they would put it in like a glass box in the library. Every day they would turn one page. So they would have like from the, let's say, Roman times until modern time art, and all the students would gather around this glass box to make drawings and to draw after the examples in this encyclopedia. It sounds totally amazing when you hear that back. That was how close China was until the end of the 70s. And then, so these students graduated, Roggeveen graduated in 83, and then they started to produce art, and there was still this field of energy was going on in the arts in China. So all these artists were producing art, but there was no infrastructure, so there was this economic growth, but there was no galleries yet, so there were no curators. People were putting their art pieces on the fences of museums, like here in Beijing, or in parks, in public parks. And this whole vibe of enthusiasm continued until 89, and so the culmination of it was this exhibition in Beijing called No U-Turn. Well, the title indicating that the artists really didn't want the momentum to go away, and also didn't want the political openness would return to conservatism again. We all know what happened. happened in June '89 in Beijing, not only on Tiananmen Square, but also in other cities throughout China. Also in Chengdu there were protests. There was also a crackdown, and that made the artists had to flee the city. They had to move away from the city because they were basically haunted by the government. Also in the case of Roggeveen, so he went to the countryside and started continued his career there together with other artists. And the artist village called the Blue Roof. And there were these artist villages all over China. But basically, artists and the city were disconnected as of that time. So there was no influence of art and artists in cities anymore. Until the end of the 90s, when collectors and creators from the West started to explore Chinese art basically and buy Chinese art. But until that time, there was basically no way for artists to share their work in cities, which was an amazingly frustrating situation because if an artist that cannot show his work is basically he doesn't have a voice, right? He doesn't have the ability to say, to tell a story. In the case of Roggeveen, there was a couple of French artists from Montpellier, curators from Montpellier coming to Chengdu to look for new artists in China. And they ended up in the Blue Roof. And they invited Roggeveen and his colleagues to come to France to show their work. And when they came back from France, it was a very successful exhibition. And when they came back, they saw something very unusual at the airport of Chengdu, namely the lineup of audience, the typical Chinese government car. And there was a couple of government officials that said, well, step in the car, we're going to take a ride and we're going to show you something. And so they did, and they went to the what is now the artist village, Flower Town, where the government officials said, listen, we heard you're very influential now, you're very talented, recognized by European creators, we would like to keep you from the city. So we would like to offer you a piece of land, each of you has a piece of land to build his own studio. And so you will the possibility to design and do that yourself. Great opportunity, of course. And also a gigantic gesture that is sort of very indicative of how the attitude of Chinese government suddenly changed towards art. And they were basically incorporating them in their strategy. This may sound like a sort of amazing story, but it's not the only grand gesture that the Chinese government does concerning art. This is, for example, a museum on the central square of Chengdu, currently under construction, 60,000 square meters, and it's one of the 4 musea currently under construction in Chengdu alone. Zaha is also making one there, and Paul Andreu, the French architect, is basically putting a museum in every city in China. There's a sort of it's very attractive. Chinese governments are really making the move now from the, let's say, hardware to the software of the city. So they're really trying to invest in the cultural scene as well. Like here in Xi'an, where gallery owners and artists set up a transformed factory from a textile factory into a very popular artistic spot, and now the government said, well, we buy the whole thing, we turn it into an art town. Or here in Chongqing, where they transformed one street into a sort of art piece 100 meters long and 10 meters high, next to the Academy of Arts. Also, again, this is not the only story. There's also the other side of that now, and that is for the other side of the story, that is small initiatives of people setting up small podiums, like here in Chengdu, a little bar, a tiny initiative of a couple of people who created a bar which is a meeting place for people in the cultural field, and then turned it into a place where people also could make their own music. It is now one of the best and most popular pop podiums in Western China. Pop podiums that then again are invited to contribute to rock festivals. Rock festivals are spreading like a disease over the whole of China, supported by the Chinese government. There's now, when I arrived in China, there was like 10 or 15 rock festivals per year in China. There's now 250. So, of course, these festivals are all looking for content, and they have to be programmed. So there's a lot of money behind it. But which bands do you program there, or how do you organize them? But then these small initiatives are invited, help us with organizing it. And this is maybe the most interesting part of Chinese organization. It is not only about China being able to push for its physical appearance of cities, for skylines, for big museums, for fast high-speed railways. Also, it is about a whole society that is transforming from being a farmer to leading an urban life. That doesn't mean that 1 billion people start making documentaries about dinosaurs, but it's more, it has to do with all kinds of things that are related to it. So it's also about building up collections of art, developing creationships, indeed programming rock festivals, etc. With in 20 years, China will have 1 billion urban citizens. It's the biggest group of urban citizens worldwide. Well, the impact of that is, of course, spectacular in terms of cultural life, or the modernization of lives. When we started this project 4 years ago, we were looking for an answer to the question: has China developed a new type of urbanism in central and western China? And the answer is yes. There's really another type of city that we've been seeing there, a type of city that we didn't see before in other places in the world. And it is roughly, you could define it roughly by stating that, or by defining it, you could define it by saying it is a city that is that has a clash between the rural and the urban. It's very much driven by migration, of course, but it's also very much driven by the physical appearance of the city first, so the physical creation of the city first, and then the people moving in. Without very much this physical appearance, without very much variation. This is a picture we took in a mall shop in Xi'an, where the mall makers were even complaining that the malls were so much alike. I mean, that says a lot, of course, about how the sort of limited variety of building types. The city, it is a type of city that is struggling with its history, how to deal with its history and with its identity. And that is also showing a big income diversity between the rich, the super rich, and the poor, people that cannot keep up with the pace. And, it's a city that, the type of city that is has a big issue with sustainability. I was already talking about pollution. The average Chinese city sees 500 new cars per day driving in its village. It's a city that, through being so much focused on its physical appearance first, also has an unhealthy real estate market. And finally, it's a city that is developing not only cultural buildings, but it has and will develop cultural content very quickly and very progressively. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that I sort of contributed a little bit about where it is on urbanism in China. Well, if you have any questions, just go to our website or drop me an email at daan@osproject.com. You can also buy a book, which I highly recommend, which is called How the City Moved to the System. Thank you very much. Yeah, are there any questions? Sorry, I talked a bit longer, but if there's people interested in...
You mentioned what was happening in the city. Is it being taken over by industrialization, John Deere moving in and taking over on the industrial scale and growth being adopted?
Yeah, so the question is, what is happening to the rural actually? Because I didn't touch upon that in the lecture. Well, the thing is that what currently happens in the rural is that only the people that cannot work stay behind. That is elderly and children. For the rest, everyone who can work moves to cities, which is pretty dramatic to see. Just basically villages without people between 20 and 55. And the grandchildren the grandparents are taking care of the grandchildren. At the same time, there has to be a transformation of. Starting with another thing. China has a complicated thing. Their most fertile grounds are at the same location as their most interesting places to create cities. That is close to the coast, which is logical because in river deltas you can make the best everywhere in the world. But it also makes up for that expanding cities are taking over countryside basically. So there is a limitation to what the Chinese government wants cities to grow. And at the same time, the amount of the countryside in China is not efficient enough. So because of its history of collective farming, it's very inefficient and it has to scale up again to become more efficient. So farmers need to have bigger pieces of land, and then when they have that, then they can ask John Deere to support them. Other questions? No? Well, then everything is super clear, I guess. Okay, well, if there's more informal questions, then you can also come and talk to me afterwards.
I can answer.
Oh, okay.
How do you position the research, and who is maybe the leadership that you're addressing? On the one hand, right, it's journalistic, and you're also your there's an English version, there's a Dutch version, there's maybe a Chinese version of the book, and I guess and then you're trying to. Is it that there's something, or is there some kind of, is it becoming a projectile to something, criticism of the situation, or is it architecture supposed to be?
Yeah, well, the thing is that I worked with a journalist, and he, in architecture, there's in a way that's what he showed me basically. In architecture, there's a sort of way that once you produce a book that is very much unread, then it must be super good because then people don't understand it. So then the quality must be, then you're really intellectual. Right? Whereas he was always writing for a weekly that was one of the best, very well read weekly in Holland. And his intention was always to reach out to the public or to an audience. And our intention was basically both. On one hand, to say something about the urban, but for a general audience. Not so much only for an audience of architects. And what we now experience now is that people they basically read our book, whereas like 9 out of 10 architecture books are not being read. And I appreciate the fact that people really are interested in what we have to say. On the question of what is the book, or what is it the critique, or what? I don't see myself as, well, my intention is not to come to China to tell people how the world works. I think it works basically the other way around. I come to China and Chinese tell me how the world works. And I think my colleague always had a bit of a different attitude towards this, because he's an independent journalist, so his attitude towards China was always a bit different than mine. But that also made our cooperation, I think, very interesting. Because I always try to sort of turn the argument around and say, well, basically 1/4 of the world population is doing it in this way, so at least maybe there's some logic to it. Whereas he would say, yeah, but actually, we should always question what they're doing, or what we see, or etc. etc. So, in that sort of, I think that kind of tension is very much expressed in the book. And the book is therefore doesn't have a single type of critique, or is not a China celebration or China bashing in any way. But it's very, as an open end. No, I said it was already good. I think it's really true.
So the whole time towards the end, I keep thinking about Marshall Berger, your book, and the parallel between this book and all that is solid comes into air, which, throughout the book talks about the struggle between modernization and modernism. And towards the end, it kind of, in the middle it talks about dream, then talks about agony, and then towards the end talks about anguish, and it used 1960s and 70s New York City to talk about anguish and struggle. But you're saying that your son was happy. That's the key difference between your reading of this kind of modernization versus modern. And I'm just curious, so this sense of happiness, how does one reconcile with it?
Well, the thing is that I think a lot of people, well, you have this happy meter, right?
I think you said happy.
Yeah. No, but I think Mr. Sun is pretty happy because he's in a quite stable situation at this moment. There's hardly anything that can happen to him, and the money that he has is enough to support the education of his grandchildren. And he's 68 now, pretty stable life. I think when you ask people in China, a lot of them are better off than a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. There's of course also the legitimate that makes up for why the governmental situation is legitimized. Right? At the same time, I think because people have it better than a year ago or 2 years ago, and they will have it better next year, their children will have a better life than they had. At the same time, you see that there's a lot of pressure, a lot of people that have insecure lives, like Mr. Daan, a lot of people that have the anxiety that their house will be torn down, like what happened to Mr. Sun, that they won't get a compensation. A lot of people, and then there's basically the anxiety of everybody, also me, living in China, about pollution, about food that's being unhealthy, about meat that's being poisoned, about baby formula that's being totally unhealthy for kids, about all kinds of protests that turn out violently. So this is a country that is undergoing a major modernization project. At the same time, that comes with that so far goes pretty stable compared to all kinds of other transformations that China has gone through over the past century, and especially that other countries go through. But it comes with a price. And the price is, well, we all know that price. It's pollution. It's basically unhealthy food. It's a sort of explosion of capitalism. The Gini image of China is bigger than in the US, so that says a lot, I guess. And sort of limited freedom, which is pretty well known which we see also the news media reporting.
I'm curious about how the new high-rises work, or these new cities. Do the inhabitants pay rent, and like who owns the shops?
Yeah.
Who owns the buildings?
Well, there's a saying that if the fountain still works, then not all the houses are being sold. So basically, all the compound that I live in, by the way, the fountain doesn't work anymore. So, but basically, a lot of these residential compounds that I showed in a couple of images, like the overview images, right, are for sale. And people are buying these apartments like crazy, really like crazy. For a couple of reasons. First of all, because they don't have any other. There's a lot of cash in the market. There's a lot of money. People cannot invest their money in other ways because the putting on, let's say, the interest rates is lower than the. When you put your money in the bank, you lose money. Secondly, because you cannot invest in foreign countries. That's very hard to transfer money outside of China. And thirdly, because the stock exchange in China is very volatile. So it's very risky undertaking to do that. So people put their money in real estate, and there is a lot of real estate. And what happens then is that a lot of these places stay empty. So, for example, you have some spare money, put it in real estate. You need to do a down payment of 20% for the first house, or 30% for the first house, and then 40% for the second, 50% for the third. Some cities are now sort of limiting that amount of housing that you can buy. So they say, for example, Shanghai has decided one family can only buy one house, which led to a lot of speed divorces. But this is how crazy the market is, basically. And then people keep the real estate empty. And the reason for that is that they basically don't need the real estate yet, or they say, well, the rental price is basically pocket change because it doesn't pay off the mortgage. So why should I rent it out? It's a lot of hassle and it basically destroys my home. And well, the money is not so interesting for me because mortgage doesn't pay off in 30 years, but maybe 50 or 60. And that is, of course, the dangerous thing, because if your rent doesn't pay off your mortgage, then you have a pretty explosive situation that, well, other countries in the West have gone through. And that is something that people are worrying for now. How will this real estate market continue in China? And if it bursts, if it's a bubble and if it bursts, that impact might be even bigger than the subprime loan crisis that hit the States. So, that's all.
I just want to sort of go back a little bit to the capitalist topic.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're really saying, are the farmers really happy about the way they live right now? I really question about that because based on what I know, the urbanization process basically issued single-handed by the government.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, a lot of farmers are really forced. They are really forced to change their lifestyle.
Yeah.
You cannot really compare like the rural lifestyle with the urbanized lifestyle because they're totally different.
Yeah.
Like in terms of the stable, like you can't really say living in a city is more stable than in a rural area because
No. That's also not what I'm saying.
so like from my point of view, they're forced to change their lifestyle. Like if you're saying like they're really happy about this. Like you were saying more in terms about the quality of the life, like the material. But in terms of the lifestyle, I would say for those people who are used to live in the countryside, they're probably not happy about losing farmland. They're probably not happy about losing the natural environment they're used to. So I really question about whether they're really happy about this kind of urbanization process.
Well, there's an interesting discussion going on the website of the New York Times about These people moving to, who work at the Foxconn factory in Shenzhen, right? The Foxconn factory producing these boys and this kind of other stuff. Because they complain in the West is very often, yeah, these people are slaves, they work in factories and they are slaves who put together our computers and we as Westerners force them to work in the factory. Well, that's not true. And that's not true. I'm not the only one saying this. Mr. Chan, the writer of the book Factory Girls, had a very interesting remark on this, because she said it's very paternalistic to think that we as Westerners, or as people in the West, basically can dictate that other people on the other side of the world go work in factories, and that they are, no, that's just nonsense. People go from the countryside to the city to improve their lives, to have salaries that are much more, much higher than in the countryside. It is, if you can compare, if you will, compare your life standing on the countryside in the sun 12 hours, 15 hours per day, with working in a factory where you earn 3-4 times more, and sort of improve your life. So maybe at a certain point you become a manager of a line, or maybe you become a secretary, you can do a course, maybe you learn English. I think these parts are very much about organization, about people developing themselves. People becoming also, you could say this organization project is also an emancipation machine. Of course, when you are, like Mr. Sun, being kicked out of your house basically, because he was threatened, so all these villagers in this village of Mr. Sun were threatened that they had to leave their house. And Mr. Sun at a certain point decided, okay, now they offer me 75,000, now I go. But there was also people that said, no, I want to have more, or I don't leave my house. And they basically got beaten out of their house. Well, of course, that is not something I would support or would say is a good form of transformation of the country or of organization. But what I'm referring to is that I think that a lot of people in the countryside have very, very hard lives. And I think that what's happening in China now is that some of their lives will improve. And that's not only materialistic, but also more in general, over the whole line. Which is not to say that if you're not happy or sitting on an IKEA chair and on just a box, I mean, of course not. That's a whole different discussion.
I'm curious if like the same model works for a country with a population of the size, right? I think that's something that a lot of you guys, and you tried to touch on it, but for example, we could also look at art going out of the way, for example, to chart a different history than that of the artist. Well, so I'm just curious about whether or not is that one
We did have Joe Plummer, and I didn't hear of this campaign. No, maybe. I think that's maybe the big problem with China, that it's not reducible. The story is not reducible to one guy, obviously. I think the story in China, in the States, is also not reducible to one guy, but it's a whole different discussion. I think that it's the reason Mr. Sun became the sort of protagonist for our story is because what happened to him is so counterintuitive. So the city literally took over his thing, just as a sort of top-down thing, as you were referring to, a top-down project that he was not choosing by himself. And but it happened to him. I think people, that is also if you look at I think the guys in the Chinese government are not racist, so they are pretty much knowing what's happening in that country. And they've been focusing very much on Chinese middle class, of course. Really like building a strong middle class that is sort of supporting well, economic development, but is also stabilizing the sort of income disparities that are now being created between the super rich, some of the people that they involve, as you can see, and the Mr. Banks of this country that basically support this whole economy. Those are the people that keep the motor running. Because they create all the real estate, they create all the computers, they create all the everything. So this middle class is super important. But what they now see is this middle class is not the only thing they should focus on. They should also focus on people that stay behind in the rural areas that you were referring to. Because that income disparity and also that disparity in terms of life is maybe even more important. So it's not only, it was a focus only on middle class in mega cities, and they're now focusing more on smaller cities, even countryside, how to improve the production on countryside, how to improve life in countryside, so that people stay behind on the countryside, don't need to move. Because it's also a pretty unhealthy situation where 300 people transform their whole lives right away. Everybody is food blues. So I think that there is a focus on more narratives and more types of development.